Hello friends, I hope you're doing well and enjoying the course content this week. I just wanted to drop a quick video talking about something that is somewhat near and dear to my heart, and that is reading Old Testament narrative. And I've enjoyed looking at some of the comments already posted on the discussion board, especially in the pastoral track, and hearing about some of experiences and thoughts about preaching Old Testament narrative. And many of you guys are bringing up the issues mentioned in Duvall and Hayes and others, primarily the issues of allegorizing and moralizing. And allegorizing is where we take an Old Testament narrative and we create kind of a one-to-one correspondence with aspects of the story that are really in no way grounded in the text. They just kind of have this idea-like relationship to New Testament realities. So a common example that's mentioned is, like an early church allegorical interpretation of Noah's Ark, where each of the stalls represents the heavenly mansions that Jesus went to prepare, has gone to prepare a place for us. And many kind of almost fanciful feeling interpretations, and allegories like that are easy to reject, and it's easy to say, oh, nobody does that. But I've also heard allegorical interpretations looking at the dove of Noah's story, the raven of Noah's story, that represents uncleanness. And so it's not difficult to slip into language talking about, well, this aspect is symbolic of this, and this is representative of this. And before you know it, we have a full-fledged allegorical reading of the Old Testament text. And I honestly think that one of the greatest ways to prevent allegorizing Old Testament text is to be willing to preach large chunks of Scripture. I have found that many people are more prone to allegorizing when they don't get the whole story. And I know this is mentioned in your reading, but I really wanted to bring this up because I find that people, we get so trained on the didactic style of Paul in his letters to where we want to unpack 2 verses for 3 weeks and 3 weeks worth of sermons, that we switch over to the Old Testament and we're changing gears and we think, oh my goodness, there's no way I can preach through 35 verses the same way that I do 2 verses in Paul. And that's exactly right. You can't do a one-to-one correspondence, but we have to realize that in the Old Testament text we're dealing with a story, and that as we're preaching and teaching that story, we're not obligated to address every single text in that story. We're looking at what's going on, what's taking place. So one of my good friends who does a lot of teaching and preaching and has researched the Old Testament quite a bit, he doesn't bat an eye at preaching the book of Esther in one sermon, or certainly the book of Jonah in one sermon, because you have here a whole story, and to divide that out almost kind of leaves you searching for how to make it relevant, right? I mean, it's like, well, I'm not to the end of the story yet. I mean, Ruth's a great example. I mean, there's kind of a couple places along the way you can draw out a principle, but until you really get to the end of the story, there's not so much to say, which is what lends us toward turning to an allegorical, symbolic, representative type interpretation, so that we have something to preach, we have something to say to people. So my encouragement to you is, as you think about preaching and teaching Old Testament narrative, is explore, be willing to challenge yourself with taking on larger chunks of Scripture, maybe even 2 chapters, depending on what the narrative is you're talking about. And I think that will help guard you against allegorizing and making some of those mistakes. So again, I look forward to hearing some comments from you guys for the rest of the week, and blessings.